Hi, everyone. Welcome to So You Want to Be an Internet Detective with Dr. Jeffrey Lewis. I have the honor and privilege of introducing him. He is the director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, which we call CNS. And he is also a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, where he teaches open source tools for non-proliferation and terrorism studies and security and arms control in Northeast Asia. Before coming to CNS, he was the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative at the New America Foundation. He's also been executive director and managing the Atom Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He's been a visiting fellow for the Center for Strategic International Studies and a desk officer for the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense Policy. I could probably take a good 10 minutes just sharing with you all of his accolades, but I won't do that. What I will do is I will drop a link to his bio in the chat. This talk has sort of been something that we have always wanted to do, but we were even more excited to do it when we heard him being lauded and touted in The Economist 2 months ago. And Jeffrey, just to sum it up, The Economist said that you and a crack team of internet detectives are doing the work that used to be solely in the purview of the intelligence community around the world. And the world is better off for it being different today. So I would like to ask you some very basic questions to get us started on today's session. And the first one would be, what is open source intelligence? Would you break it down for us like we are 5 years old?
Sure. Well, it's super nice to be talking to you. I think open source intelligence is exactly what it sounds like when you break it into its constituent parts. So intelligence is the word that in the United States we typically use to refer to what the government does when it gathers information about foreign military capabilities, political, economic information. It's really a way of knowing about the world. There are lots of different ways of knowing about the world, but the idea that you would take all that information and put it in a kind of single analytic framework that you could use to educate and inform policymakers, that's a sort of Anglo-American thing. It's very distinct and has a lot to do with the founding of the U.S. intelligence community in the 1950s and their sort of aspirations to be academic and be rigorous and be serious. And so, it's that analytic piece, right? But of course, all their information, they use some open information, but a lot of their information was secret, right? So you get spies or you have spy satellites. And what we've really noticed is we are now able to kind of mimic that in many ways, in the way that the intelligence community in the United States in the 1950s wanted to emulate academia. In academia, well, we already have that, right? We already have those rigorous scholarly ways of knowing, but we didn't have the toys that they have. But increasingly, we live in this era of cell phones, which I have a whole little bit about. It's like my little vaudeville act with a cell phone. We have all these new tools and new technologies that allow us to do the same kinds of technical work that inform the intelligence community so that we can participate. It's very important for me. I note, with the passing of Colin Powell, it brings me back to why I got into this business in the first place, which is watching the run up to the invasion of Iraq, where I felt like many of the things that we were being told by the United States government, which presented this information as what the intelligence community thought, although we've since found it was a little more complicated than that. But it seemed very dubious at the time from a scholarly, academic, rigorous perspective. But of course, we didn't have the tools. And so civil society I felt we were silent. And so one of the things I've really been excited about is the ability for civil society to participate. So when I say open source intelligence, I mean precisely that: a public, openly available tool for civil society that is identical to the kinds of intelligence that governments get on the secret side.
Thank you for that explanation, because I actually was trying to Google it to see how I would break it down, and there's so many different parts to it, and depending on what angle people are looking at it from, they approach it differently. So it's so good to hear an actual explanation that I can also share with other people in the future. My next question would be, where does one go to become an internet sleuth?
The internet, silly. I mean, it also helps to have a master's degree from the Monterey, from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey.
Yes, I love that.
But, I mean, one thing that I love about this particular field is that it is by definition open. And so, I often have people ask like, well, how can I participate? And the answer is like, you don't have to ask permission. You can access a lot of these tools because they are open. Many of them, the vast majority, I would say, are public or free. And you can access that information, and you can go online and you can participate in debates, and you can meet people and your work can be recognized. And I think a great example of this is Decker Eveleth, who is an admitted student now, who is the person who did the hard work of actually finding the silos that China was building out in the desert. I mean, we had hired him one summer, and we have been sort of doing that work together. And I sort of encouraged him to go do it, but he really went and did it. And he's an undergraduate, and he came to our attention as a community, as an undergraduate, who looked at the things we were doing publicly and said, I can do those same things. I can get Google Earth. I can get a Sentinel account from the European Space Agency. I can download videos off YouTube. I can do exactly what they're doing, except for he decided he could do it a little better than we could. And he was right? He's very, very, very adept at it. And so, my advice to people who want to know like how they get involved is pick something you like or you care about or that you're passionate about, and then just do it. And if you do it well, people will respond to it. And even if you don't do it perfectly, because nobody does it perfectly, it's a pretty healthy, good community of people who will help you learn and make you stronger. So, it's not one of these things where you have to wait for someone to give you permission. You should jump in with both feet. Although if you come to miss and you jump in with both feet, I'll be on the side of the pool like I am with my children, holding your hand, and we can jump in together.
And for those of y'all who think that he's exaggerating, he's not. I took his class, Open Source Tools, when I was a student at Miss, and it was my favorite class in a pandemic, which I think is saying a lot because the Zoom fatigue was real. But I showed up for his class twice a week, and so did everybody else, which was so surprising if you think about just how difficult it might be to learn how to swim without someone physically helping you in the pool. Jeffrey, I have a question that's a little bit probably more existential. Why do it?
Okay.
Why be an internet sleuth at all?
Yeah. Well, okay. One answer is it's fun. And, we do a lot of strange things at CNS. Like we like to collect things. Like we have a big, we have a rocket engine, and we have a light table. And whenever we acquire one of these bizarre things, someone always asks me like, well, what are you going to do with it? And the truthful answer is, I don't know. Like, it's just fun, right? Like a lot of times we imagine that we're sitting down and, you know exactly what you're going to go look for, and you're going to go ahead and find it. And sometimes it works like that, right? With Decker, it was, hey, from everything US government is saying, I think there might be some extra Chinese silos out there. Let's go look. But a lot of other times you discover things, you stumble upon them, and you're doing it because you're interested and you're curious and you're just looking around. So, the biggest reason I would say is to do it because you enjoy it, because you have a passion for it. If you sort of then ask me like, well, why do I think it's so fun? Then we get to those kind of answers. So, one reason to do it is this is a way of knowing about the world. Right? There are different ways of knowing about the world. You can read books, you can go talk to people, you can go have experiences. And by the way, those are all important things, and you're a better analyst if you do all those things. But you can also use technology to learn things, right? So, I'm someone who, when I go visit a place and I kind of want to get my bearings and I want to know where it is, I go to Google Earth too. And I look at satellite photographs of the place and I look at maps, and it's just a way of knowing. And for me, if you are interested at all in these broader issues, it's incredibly empowering, because when I got into the field and was interested in a topic, if you wanted to know about China's nuclear weapons programs, what you hoped is that somebody who actually knew about them would tell you some stuff. And then you had to decide whether that stuff was true or not, or whether that person even knew what that person was talking about. And, so a lot of the work on nonproliferation in the 70s and 80s, which is quite good, by the way, it's not to say that it's bad, but it's unfalsifiable. It's a Chinese official said this, a US government official said that, and, truth's probably somewhere in between. And today we have this kind of option of like, well, I could just go look at a satellite image. If you say there's a factory being built there, they say there isn't, we go look, right? I mean, just on a trivial note, in Carmel, where I live, we had a silly debate. And that debate was about plastic lawns. You had to get approval if you wanted to put in a plastic lawn. And in a small town, people began pointing fingers at each other. It's like, well, you have a plastic lawn. No, it's real. And, all this nonsense. And I was like, you people are like, this is stupid. And so I went and I asked the satellite company for a picture of Carmel, and I looked at a near infrared image and I could see whether lawns were plastic or not. Like, we didn't have to have that whole bizarre, complicated, screaming debate. Like, there's a picture from space and you check the near infrared band and like look at the yard, right? So it's a way of knowing, and I find it really valuable, both about the subject matter that we work on, but it also then is valuable throughout life to know that you can use technical information to get facts when the humans you're talking to let you down.
I think everyone feels there has been a lot of letting down lately. So I think it's a bit empowering to know that if you feel strongly about something and you want to look it up, that there is a way to do it, and that there are people out there who are doing it not for any particular political affiliation or party, but just because they have an interest and they have the access. So that leads me to my next question, which is, I would say I'm a child of the internet in the sense that I was an early teen when we had dial-up, and or maybe I'm I don't know, like a foremother of the internet, who knows at this point. But when did it become a thing for people to be internet detectives? Because I feel like we went from like chat rooms and MySpace to all of a sudden like people being able to do incredible things just by using the same tools that I use on a daily basis to look up, best Ethiopian restaurants in my city.
Yeah, so I don't think it was, it's this thing, right, which is not as old as the internet, right? And the example I always give with this thing, which I'm now getting lots of messages on and I will stop looking at, so I'm old, so I don't know how many people are going to remember this, but I always say, does anybody remember what it was like to share vacation photographs in like the 1980s? Like, how did that work? Right. Yeah. So, for those of you who are too young to remember that, you had an object called a camera, and it was a single use object. It only did the one thing, which was take pictures. And they could be fairly bulky if you wanted a decent camera. And, in it, you had a roll of film, right? And it had a set number of exposures, and you had to basically use all the exposures. And then when you had your little roll of film, which I love, you had to physically take it to someone who would develop it for you, right? Now, maybe you were the kind of person who had your own dark room, but like that was like a little fancy. And if you were really smart, you would ask for doubles, right? And so that person would develop the pictures and you would get the physical objects back. And if you were really, really, really smart, you would then like flip the thing over and like write all the information on the back, like, like Aunt Sue, Topeka, Kansas, 1978. And if you didn't do that, 30 years later, you realize you didn't remember, was that really Aunt Sue? I can't tell. Where are we? You know, like you lose all that. And then you have to take that picture and you put it in an envelope with like a stamp and you write an address, and a human being physically delivers it to another person, right? And that person opens it up and they have the picture and they can't share it with anyone else because they only have one copy, right? It was really inefficient to collect information, to store information, and share information. And so everything we do, I can find an analog where someone did it in like the 1950s or the 1960s, but it was freaking hard, right? Because instead of going to YouTube, right, you needed to go get like a film. And so this thing, right, changes all that, because this thing is a camera, but it's constrained only by the size of its memory. So you can take lots and lots and lots of pictures. You don't actually need to write the metadata down because it will save where and when you took the picture if you're so interested. And if you want to get really creepy, Yandex will probably tell you that, yeah, that's Aunt Sue in the picture. You know, there are face recognition algorithms, and you're immediately connected to the internet. And so you can share as many copies of that photograph you want with as many people as you want, right? You can put it on Twitter so the whole world can see it. And then it's shared, right? And so that really changes things, because if you imagine trying to transition from a world where, let's say you see, well, a great example is, let's say you see a missile in a North Korean parade on TV. You're like, oh, hey, wait, I want to analyze that. Today, where you see it is on YouTube, and you just rip it from YouTube. It takes about 15 seconds. In the day, you had to like call NBC and see if they send you a video cassette of the thing, which they may or may not do. And then you're like going forward, going back, going forward, going back. It is so much easier now to just extract that data. So that to me is the change. It's a change across the entire society, right? I mean, mostly we use it for sharing cat memes, but we can also use that same set of changes to look at nuclear weapons, although the cat memes are better.
So I think the next thing that we just now need to get down to is the how of it. So how do people do all these things? And one of the methods that you shared with us in your class, which I thought was incredibly interesting, was the geolocation challenge. So maybe you could walk us through the how, maybe by showing us practically, or
yeah, absolutely. So I have a little image which I'm happy to share with you, but it's not very high resolution on the screen. So I will go ahead and put it in the chat to everyone. And you can just everyone should be able to open up this image on their own. But I have my own version of it, which I am going to try to share. So let's just do that. It's part of a much larger presentation I have that people may not want. So this is like a funny, trivial example, but it goes to show just how much data there really is out there, right? So, oops, sorry, you don't care about that. You care about this. I was supposed to do a podcast with my friend Aaron, and my friend Aaron was late. And to rub my nose in the fact that there was a big time difference between Geneva, where he lived, and where I lived, you know, I was at the start of my day. He was running late because he was having a nice time, and so he sent me this picture. And so, just to sort of torment him, I looked at the picture and I said, "Okay, Aaron, you're sitting at Le Studio Cafe near the Place de Bourgfort in Geneva. You're with your wife and your child. She's still nursing, and you're wearing a checked shirt." And he thought that was pretty funny.
How?
All of that information, right, is available in this photograph. Now, the easiest thing to say, which it sort of ruins it for everyone, is because he took it with this phone, the metadata was there. So I could have pulled the lat long, but I did it the quote unquote hard way, because I thought it might be a little bit easier. Actually, you know, instead of doing a slide, I think I'll open the image itself in the yeah, here, because I can zoom in. All right, so like one question is like how do you know where he is? And this is kind of fun, is if you look, I don't know if you all can see this over here, there's a receipt. He's paid his bill, right? And you can just see it says something that ends up being pretty close to Le Studio Cafe. You have to struggle to make it out, but you could definitely go ahead and look for cafes in Geneva, get a list, and make a match pretty fast. But then there are other things that help give that location away, which is the table, right? And so you can go into Google Earth and you can find pictures of cafes, and you can find this exact table. I happen to have spent a lot of time in Geneva, and so sometimes you just kind of know how to go about things. The Place de Bourg Fort is a Roman forum. It's been the center of Geneva for several thousand years. And so it's not a bad guess if somebody sends you a random picture from Geneva to start in the middle and work out. So again, like I say, I did it the hard way. I was like, oh, that's a cafe. I think maybe it's a studio. I don't know. I went to Place de Bourg Fort, and it's just right off the beaten path. And then immediately in Google Earth, you can do a bunch of things, right? So I said, you can tell the tables. The tables are very distinctive, although now when I do this example in class, the tables have changed, which ends up being useful for geolocating. Do you see this little door, this little pair of doors, probably for like putting coal in an old-fashioned building?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see those in Google Street Maps. So once you find the cafe in Google, you can drop yourself, and it has a street view, and you can find this drain pipe and these doors, and so that's pretty good. And then there's my favorite trick, which is if you look at the beer bottle, can you see the reflection?
Yep. That's
the Place de Bourg Fort. You can make out the trees and their locations, and confirm visually that that's where he's sitting. So, I mean, there's the receipt, which when you really examine it, and you kind of know what you're looking for, you can make out all the words. But then you have all this other data, which he's not really thinking is present, right? Of course, there's also the stroller, right? And the fact is there are two drinks. Now, it's a little bit of an inference. I mean, perhaps he's with a friend who has the friend's child out, right? But I'm pretty sure that there are two people as well as a child present. And then there's this detail, right? Which is this beer, this is just a glass. This is the beer that's being consumed. And from the brand, it's alcohol-free. Now, admittedly, I know a little bit about it, Aaron and his spouse. I know that she does drink. But the fact that she's sitting there drinking alcohol-free beer, I think, I say, your son is still nursing. And it's like, yes. And then the last thing, which is kind of fun, is, the reflections are really useful. Once you kind of know what you're looking at here, can you see Aaron taking the selfie and the reflection in his wine?
Yes.
Here's his body, here's his arm, he's wearing a checked shirt. Right. So, the point of this example is just to illustrate that there's all this information that's easily shared, right? Because in the old days, he could have sent me the photograph in the mail, but it would have gotten there, a month later. But he can immediately email me that picture. I can immediately use the internet to look up the cafe. I have a high resolution picture. I mean, it's a very high resolution. It costs nothing to send enormously detailed images where I can pick off reflections. I can look at Google Earth. I can go ahead and get the terrain of the place. I can get a street view. All of that information is available to me in a matter of a few seconds so that I can tease him with all of that data right back before he has a chance to pack up his stuff and get home and do the podcast that he was supposed to do.
Oh my goodness. That's like it. I mean, I've seen you, we've done this in your class, and I lived in Geneva before moving to the US. And I was like, I wonder where that is. And I was like, which part of Geneva is that? So like, that's incredible how much
it is useful though. I will say, again, it's a way of knowing. So, you don't, the first time you do it, it probably seems impossible because like, well, he could be anywhere in Geneva, who knows, right? But you start to realize that, people aren't actually random in that way. It does make sense to start to reason through like, well, where might he be? Where could I look? And I think the place that comes out is in Decker finding the Chinese silos. He did a pretty brute force approach in terms of just looking through lots of data, but he didn't start at one end of China and go to the other. He sat down and he said, okay, well, we've mapped all of China's missile bases. So we know where they are. And we can see over the years that China has moved those bases from one type of place to another. So we kind of know where China would put something like this. And so he was able to say, well, here are the places I would expect to find it, and I can search those. And it wasn't in the first place he looked, but it also wasn't the last, right? So the more you do it, the more you start to think about the world this way, the more you realize that there's a ton of data just sitting around waiting for someone to come and pick it up.
So Jeffrey, if people have, you've whet people's appetites for doing this sort of thing just with this example, do you have any resources in terms of like people to follow on Twitter or links or books to read? I mean, obviously there's your podcast and your website. Other than that,
get a master's degree. Look, it really depends because there are a lot of people who do this kind of work now. This is not an unusual or strange field. I mean, one of my favorite little anecdotes is a lot of our graduates go work for banks. And it's like, well, why would they work for a bank? It's because banks care a lot about money laundering. And so when you can show up and you can be the kind of person who's like, I know how to creep on someone's Facebook page. I know how to build out what their network of affiliates looks like. I know how to look at a picture of a plane and then go find in plane tracking where that plane is flying back and forth. Once you have that set of tools, right? Banks are like, oh, you're extremely useful. Please help us make sure that we're not handling drug money, right? Because the government tends to get very angry about that. And so we have a bunch of people go do that kind of work. You can do this work as a journalist. I think, we tend to focus on non-proliferation because it's non-proliferation in terrorism studies, but the, Bellingcat and the BBC have done remarkable work on human rights violations, where, there's the BBC Anatomy of a Killing where some soldiers in one country murdered some people on video, and the government said, it wasn't in our country, right? It was someplace else. They don't look like our soldiers. And the BBC was able to geolocate exactly where those videos occurred and to use Facebook accounts to identify that.
Oh, is that it? I'm still going to ask.
Maybe we could mute
I don't
that
actually know
person.
the girl who was here before, but did you finish her?
Oh, Tash?
Oh, is that who that is? Okay,
Yeah, I
I
should have
have
introduced you guys.
Sorry, I didn't think about it.
No, I didn't. Yeah, she lived.
Mute yourself. Anyway, so the other example is Bellingcat. There was a protester who was killed in Colombia, I think, and working with a Colombian organization, they were able to take all of the social media footage and track the person who fired the nominally non-lethal round, I guess, but non-lethal was not a great term. They killed the protester. They were able to follow that person from the beginning to the end, right? So, the question of who you follow depends on what you're interested in. But I will say that, one example that I'm particularly admiring of is the New York Times has a visual investigations team. And they're extremely good. And we've worked with them a little bit, and I just have the greatest respect for them. And I'll tell you, it's whenever the New York Times publishes a story that I think is false, right, that I'm kind of angry about, I'm always like, why didn't they check with the visual investigations team? They would have told them that was wrong. Because it is this incredible resource that is unlike anything that I think any other major newspaper is doing.
So,
yeah, and Christian Trebard, who I had in the open source class. Sorry, someone said this in the chat. I can still see it. He came and talked to the open source class, and he's fantastic. that whole crew is just amazing.
So Jeffrey, I have a question about a more recent sort of open source investigation that you performed, which would be it was the 2020 Iranian missile strike at Al Ain Assad Air Base.
Ain al-Assad, yeah.
Ain al-Assad, that's it.
Well, I mean, I
Could
don't
you-
speak Arabic, so it's probably much worse than that, right?
Could you share a little bit about what it is that you did and why it was important for those who don't know?
Yeah, that's a really interesting case study where the United States and Iran, this was 2 years ago now, really came very close, I think, to a military conflict. And shortly after the US killed Qasem Soleimani, who was an Iranian general, who was involved in a lot of Iran's proxy conflicts, especially in Iraq, the Iranians ended up retaliating by conducting a missile strike against a US air base in Iraq, a place called Ain al-Assad. And the thing that was interesting about that was after the strike, the US government really worked to downplay the damage. The Secretary of Defense actually stood up and said there was no major damage to the airbase, which I think is a thing you could get away with 20 years ago, right? I mean, if the Iranians say that they hammered this airbase, and then the Americans say, nah, it was just a flesh wound, you don't know, right? Who's telling the truth? This government says this government says this. I guess it's unknowable. But we had been working with a number of companies, and a company called Planet imaged the airbase the morning after the attack. And so we were able to immediately get imagery, and it showed that the attack had actually been significant, that it had destroyed a lot. The Defense Department had said that there had been no casualties, which means anyone wounded, right? Being killed is, some casualties are people being killed, but people who are just injured are also casualties. And we were like, no, they're casualties. Like, maybe nobody was killed. I believe that, but the scale of destruction here is just too great. And then people had been saying this other thing is when the Defense Department said, well, they didn't really hit anything. People started saying, well, the Iranians avoided hitting anything because they were scared, right? We deterred them. And so they fired some missiles, but they deliberately missed. That was a thing people started saying. And when we got the satellite picture, we're like, you're crazy. Like, we are on the brink of war. They are trying to kill people. They are angry about what we have done. They are retaliating. And if, in our view, if you don't get a hold of the situation, it's going to spiral out of control. And so one thing that once we published those images, the Defense Department then came out and said, like, yeah, okay, well, it was a pretty substantial attack. And then they brought reporters to the base and let them see it. And so my sense has always been that the Department of Defense had a particular narrative that they intended to present, which was that the killing of Qasem Soleimani worked, and that the Iranians had not really retaliated, that they had been too afraid to really hit us. And that was a sign that our policy was sensible and working and things were fine. And we could all go back to worrying about, whatever we were worrying about in January 2020 before the bad times. And it's just not true, right? That this was really escalatory, that the US had done something bad and the Iranians had then also done something bad. And when you looked at the pictures, you could see things were on the verge of getting out of control. There's a little funny coda to it, which is we then went through, along with Fabian Hinz, who is an analyst who used to work with us, and we located each of the craters because you could see them in a satellite picture. And then we measured to the nearest sort of plausible target, like what were they shooting at? And we were able to generate an accuracy assessment, like how accurate are Iran's missiles? And the funny thing is, the answer was that the missiles are like more or less as accurate as the Iranians say. Not quite as good as they say. Like, when they give you their number, it's like on the best day, but pretty close, right? So for the first time, we're able to sort of start to make some analytic judgments about the quality of Iranian missile guidance based on this real world event. So, it's great from my perspective because it's transparency that forces governments to be more honest and open, even though we don't always like the answer, right? But then also there's this kind of broader contribution of knowledge. You can really take these kinds of events and learn about military capabilities and create a base of knowledge that you can kind of go forward.
Okay, I think we can start with our question and answer session because I know people will have great questions for you. So Galina's question was, she said, the idea of finding anything is so exciting and frightening at the same time. You mentioned some Chinese bases. So my question is, what details do you look for while looking for some military based or weapons location if you do not know where to look? Is there an algorithm or maybe an app for that?
Yeah, so this is a thing we spend a lot of time talking about in the open source class because people have kind of the wrong idea about looking at satellite imagery. And the example I always give is we all know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs because the United States, using aircraft, takes pictures of missile bases in Cuba. A thing that people don't often process, and like it's wild when you really think about it, there weren't any pictures of missiles. They did not get any pictures of the missiles. What they got were pictures of the bases, which the photo interpreters were able to conclude correctly, I might add, were bases for missiles. And because of the way the bases were set up, right, they were able to conclude that there were missiles present, right? So they would see the trailers that could transport the missiles. They would see the big tents where they could park the trailers with the missiles on them. They could see the launch areas that were prepared. They could see these things called launch tables, the metal structures you sit the missile on. They could see all that inferential evidence, but there were no missiles. And this is a real challenge because when the photo interpreters had to explain to President Kennedy, like, hey, you may have to end the world, right? They did so on the basis of images that he could not interpret. And very famously, Robert F. Kennedy, his brother, said that when he looked at the pictures in the meetings, to him, it looked like the Cubans were building a basement for a farmhouse. And he was very relieved to know that no one else in the room, after the photo interpreters left, everybody else in the room was like, did you understand that? And they were all like, no, right? So correctly interpreting a photograph is very difficult because you're not actually going to see the missiles. I mean, sometimes you get really lucky. I was looking for a uranium enrichment facility in China, and they carved the initials of the facility into like some plants. It was like topiary. So, and with a big atom. So that was easy, but generally countries don't do that. So in the case of those Chinese silos, what happened was we looked at known locations where China was building missile silos. Right. So these are holes in the ground where you can put a missile in a canister, and they've got like a heavy concrete door and that can slide away and out comes the missile. And what we discovered in looking at known facilities is that they would erect these giant inflatable structures, like the kind that you would, like kids would play soccer in, right? Like an air dome. So we started calling them the bouncy castles of death. And those are very distinct structures. And you might find one in a city where kids play soccer, but Decker really did the effort, and he looked and looked and looked. And what he found was, a field where there were, and by a field, I mean a giant geographic area where there were like 100 of them, and they're all spaced 3 kilometers apart. So this is not, it's not the world's biggest soccer training camp. And so when you look at something like that, you have 2 things, right? You have one is you have a positive identification of a signature that you're looking for. But the second thing, and this is so important, is what you're looking at doesn't fit. It's not right for the place you're looking at, right? Like if you saw the Cuban Missile Crisis photographs, one of the things they got very worked up about was the turning radius on the roads. Because farm equipment has pretty tight turning radius. You don't have big, gentle sloping curves, but the size, scale, and arrangement of the roads that the Soviets were building in Cuba were for giant long trailers, right? And so it was very easy for them to say, that road doesn't belong in a rural Cuban area. If you saw it next to like a factory, then there would be some other explanation for it. So that's kind of how you have to go about that. Is there an algorithm? God, someday I hope so. I mean, we are working with companies to try to teach them to use artificial intelligence in order to look for signatures and help us search areas. And, the answer is like, yeah, it's okay. It's not bad. But so far we haven't had like really killer AI. And maybe someday we will.
I'm actually going to pause the recording now just to allow folks to feel freer to ask questions and know that it's not going to be anywhere, not from us anyway. Jeffrey, before we close, I was wondering if you had any message of hope to give us as we are facing times where you said basically eyes are so 2020 already. We need radar skills and thermal imaging, etc. So any hope for us?
Well, I mean, yeah, I have lots of hope. Things always seem bad, right? Things are always not what we want them to be in the world. One of my mentors is Mort Halperin, who was worked in the Johnson and Nixon administrations, and then resigned from the Nixon administration over the secret bombing of Cambodia. And the Nixon administration planned to burgle his office because they thought he had some documents, and their plan to cover it up. His office was the Brookings Institution. They were going to firebomb his office. And so, I think we have this tendency to look at the past and say like, oh, it was so much better then, and it's just really bad now. And I think that's not true. I think we have always had these challenges in this country, and there's always been an effort to try to, and the world as a whole, and there's always been, some people who are trying to make it better, right? And at least for me, I look at the tools that I have available to me today, and the way that I can participate in debates and argue and try to hold powerful people accountable. And I am really excited about those tools. So I think if you are the sort of person who looks at the situation in the world and says, I think I can make a positive difference, or at least I'm motivated to do that. I care about doing that. I really, I want to do that. The good news is you have way more tools at your disposal than anyone ever in human history. And it's really, they're cool and it's fun. So, you do have this opportunity to take advantage of this moment. And I would say embark on a career that, I have found to be just endlessly fascinating.
Thank you once again, Jeffrey, for everything.